Hello everyone, I'm Rajesh Merchandani. I'm the Vice President for Communications and Policy Outreach at the Centre for Global Development here in Washington. Now, if you don't know, the Centre works to come up with new ideas about how the policies and practices of governments and powerful institutions like the World Bank can be improved to become fairer for people in developing countries. We focus a lot of our work on how to finance development. So I'm delighted to be asked to take part in this interview for the Financing for Development MOOC offered by the World Bank's Open Learning Centre with the new Chief Operating Officer of the World Bank, Kristalina Georgieva. Kristalina, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me in this program.
Now, your most recent previous roles that many people will know have been at the EU as European Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Response, and as the European Commission Vice President for Budget and Human Resources. You've also held several positions at the bank previously, so it's sort of a homecoming to the bank for you, but this is a new role. So I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about what you expect to be doing in this role and what your previous roles, what kind of perspective they'll give you in this work.
Well, the World Bank has created this new position of Chief Executive Officer to make sure that all parts of the World Bank group are aligned and they function as one. For those who may not know much about us, the World Bank has the part that finances poorest countries, so-called IDA, International Development Association. It has the part that finances middle-income countries, the IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and then we have private sector arm, and we have a guarantee arm. Now, what we are doing is to organize the management and delivery on these three pillars. IBRD, IDA, for which I am the Chief Executive Officer, basically running the World Bank, and then IFC with the Chief Executive Officer, MIGA with a Chief Executive Officer. Why is this done exactly now? Because what we recognize is that while there is quite a lot going on in development and the world is delivering some 135 billion in concessional finance, the needs are huge and there is plenty of financial resource that is currently underutilized. It sits in the World Bank's coffins. The liquidity in the world is enormous, and yet it doesn't make the leap from bank to project finance. So what we want is to turn the World Bank group, including the part I'm responsible for, into a catalyst of massive transformative finance to go into the developing world. The phrase we use is from billions to trillions. Just to give people a sense of why this is so important and what does it mean. At the World Bank, IBRD, we have a total of $15 billion paid in capital. This is what member states have given us so we can raise money to invest in development.
15.
With this 15 billion paid in capital, we have so far raised 700 billion in loans to developing countries, contributing to growth and jobs and fighting poverty. We also have provided 20 billion to IDA, to the part that funds the poorest countries. So you can say, well, that's great. Isn't that enough? Yeah, this is a great catalyst of finance already. But imagine that instead of being satisfied with raising money at the financial markets and then investing some 20-30 billion dollars a year, we use this money as yet another catalyst to remove the obstacles for private sector to invest, to bring down the perceived risk in developing countries, and then have trillions virtually being injected in growth and prosperity and poverty reduction and fighting climate change in the developing world. So that new business mentality is what defined the need for my position. run the World Bank as a business that, as you know, as the best institution in the development business, with the objective to make that financial resource at the scale that countries require. Infrastructure. The deficit in infrastructure finance is in the order of trillions. Well, we can choose to either lend a couple of billions a year in infrastructure, or use this money to guarantee private sector flows in these areas of infrastructure that can be commercially viable: airports, ports, in some cases roads, rail. Or take education. We can use our grant financing and our concessional lending to invest in education, and we stop there. Or we can say, can we create a social bond financing with the brand name of the World Bank, so we can raise, especially from socially responsible investors, more money to go into education. So these are the challenges we are struggling with, and we are also looking at the totality of multilateral development banks. Can we together move mountains in terms of financing for development?
That point of working together with the other multilateral development banks, we may come back to that later on. It echoes work that CGD has done about kind of creating more of a system of multilateral development banks. But let's return to the idea of the billions to trillions agenda, which is the SDG agenda, the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. From what you're saying, it sounds like the thinking at the bank has shifted from, we are one player in this, to we want to be absolutely pivotal, and what we want to do is changing as well. Rather than we're going to invest in this one discrete project, we're actually the catalyst for everything. Is that the ambition we're talking about?
The ambition of the World Bank is to be a transformative force for good in a world that is changing very rapidly, but it is also a more crisis-prone, disaster-prone, conflict-prone world. And for that reason, the requirements for presence and financing are changing, they're expanding, and we cannot anymore do our traditional project financing as we have done it for decades and just stop there. We have to be more creative, and we have to be also leaning forward more on why is it that in certain places the financial resources remain insufficient? What is it that needs to change? And I'll give you the three things that are the same but also changing with the World Bank. One, our role in policies. Very often it is the wrong policies that are depriving countries and people from opportunities. Let's take the most obvious: corruption. When there is this sucking sound of money disappearing because of corruption, then of course the investment climate is such that most likely we are losing on opportunities. Or take the allocation of resources. When countries are year after year under-investing in their people, of course it is very difficult to then build up a strong platform for growth. And that engagement on policies has been always part of what we do at the bank, and we want to do more and do better.
But if you're, sorry to interrupt, but if you're going to change your role from being the financer of projects, where you have a lot of leverage in the kind of policies that frame those projects, to a catalyzer of other investors, are you going to dilute your ability to kind of change policy?
What one, we are not going to stop doing projects. We would just do projects differently. Rather than funding 80% with the World Bank money, 20% from the country, we would use the bank's component to be attracting participation from others. And by the way, not just from private sector, also from other MDBs, other donors. But secondly, question is, what is more helpful? To do a World Bank road, for example, with World Bank procurement, or to help a country to have a very good procurement system? Move it to e-procurement. Just to tell you this, I mean, going to electronic procurement, it changes dramatically that very issue we talked about, the risk of corruption. When you put the information out for everybody to see, then the so-called leakages in the system naturally are reduced. You make the citizens the supervisors of activities. So
it's not even just about corruption, Anna. That's about better value for money.
It is also for just making it more effective, making it possible for citizens to engage, for communities to have a voice. And of course, we can do our procurement for our project as e-procurement, very transparent, or we can work with a country or a sectoral agency for the whole procurement system to improve. And what we want is to see the World Bank doing more of the latter. And that, of course, goes into other areas like environment or climate. You would be surprised how strong the demand for World Bank expertise is in an area like renewables, energy efficiency, adaptation to climate change, like water resource management, land management. Why is this happening? Well, because countries are experiencing already the impact of climate change, and they recognize that in this area, it is best to learn from others. In my new position, I chair the board of directors of the World Bank, and every board meeting we have, I would hear from board members, both from developed and developing countries. They want to see more South-South knowledge transfer. They want to see the bank being this transmission line of what has worked in one place to work in another.
How does this reflect what the bank will be doing differently?
Well, it reflects in the way we engage with our member states. We used to pay less attention to, for example, to what extent there is domestic resource mobilization. So we bring our resources, we complement locally what is being mobilized, but we don't emphasize so much how domestic resource mobilization can be accelerated. Now this is a big chunk of what we do. And actually one very interesting observation, and that is, I'm quoting one of our board members, is that what the bank does is learning by lending the same way our countries learn by borrowing. And the question is, what is our level of ambition? Do we want to solve one problem in one locality, or we want to get the whole sector to transform? So you take energy and you work on changing the energy mix, of course, with the country. This is for people there. And I think that the big change in the bank that I have seen since I returned here is that focus on the big transformative actions that the bank can support because of this ability to seamlessly transfer knowledge from one place to another, from China to Vietnam, from Vietnam to Bangladesh. That kind of transmission line is what I value the most.
Sure, I think you've articulated very well and very clearly the ambition, the changing ambition at the bank. What I'm trying to understand a bit more about is how you're going to translate that will, that new ambition, into actually leveraging more from the private sector. How are you going to? What are the tools? What are the mechanisms? How are you going to drag them in?
Well, first, it is in that policy arena. I'll give you an example. I was just in Vietnam, and there we have been funding the energy sector for years. Hugely positive impact. Now Vietnam has provided access to electricity to 98% of the people, including in remote rural areas. We have been part of it. They have built quite an effective contribution of hydropower. We have been part of it. And their next horizon is moving to solar and possibly wind. I look at the bank and they say, what you can do for us is not to fund the solar panels, private sector can do that, but to help us with the regulatory environment and to help us with storage of solar power so we can actually go on a large scale. I met with the private sector in Vietnam and they're very excited about that. They don't want to see the bank doing the traditional solar power project that we used to, when it was necessary, we used to do it. They want to see us unlocking a major injection of new capacity through clean energy.
So taking that solar power example, how would that actually work in practice? You
What
wouldn't just be building a World Bank funded solar power plant.
Exactly,
You want
exactly.
Right.
What we would do is we would work with the Vietnam Electricity Company to define the regulatory conditions, so there is predictability for private sector on what the price would be.
So if you need a regulation change, then that's where World Bank resources could
exactly.
be used.
And then we would fund that part that cannot be yet attractive for private sector, and it is storage. And then maybe there may be an element of distribution connecting to the grid. Maybe we are looking at that. But the rest, the building of solar capacity, private sector can do. So we would invest $1 and we probably would draw in $10 to $15 in solar production capacity. In kind of the old bank thinking, we would have gone there, we would have said, okay, regulatory capacity, yes, important, and here is a package of solar production, like, big solar plant somewhere. We would have not thought, what is the difference? We would have not thought, what is it that the private sector can fund that we do not have to fund? What is it that we absolutely have to fund because otherwise it's not gonna draw private resources? And that is a mindset change for our staff. Also, the integrity of the World Bank group, one World Bank group. IFC, MIGA, IDA, IBRD, all working together. This may sound like trivial, oh well, you're one group, of course you would work together, but there is a underlying difference of the different elements of the group, and what we're doing now is to say, wait a minute, isn't it better for us to be a continuum, so we actually think of the development impact together? And that brings the expertise of the, going back to the Vietnam story, our private sector people, of course, are those who have brought the relevant private sector participants. They know them, they are their partners. The public sector people, those that I am like cheering and responsible for, they bring their knowledge of the state-owned enterprise in the energy sector, the understanding of the government, and the reservoir of trust we have built over the years with the Vietnamese authorities. Together, we connect. And what often is the impediment for investments to happen? Lack of trust between the private sector, the public sector. Us working together, we facilitate overcoming that lack of trust.
Some might think, or some might ask, the World Bank's been around for 70 years. Why hasn't it been doing this already? Has it not been working in a coordinated way? Are there separate parts that have been competing?
There was a very good reason for that. We have been created as separate elements of the group for a reason. Mm-hmm. The public sector arm of the bank to work with the public sector, the private sector to reach out to the private sector. And it was a smaller world and less demanding world. Now if you look at the world economy, $78 trillion last year. The World Bank Group in its totality in the order of 50, 60 billion. Why, if we want to make a dent in development, we have to bring all our capacity together. In the world I was born, that was so much smaller and slower in how it moved. Each one of these parts of the World Bank Group can do a good job, and the sense of urgency of this bringing the collective was just less. Now with the Sustainable Development Goals, with the climate agenda, we have no choice but to pinch with the collective power of the World Bank Group, the other development banks, the others that are there to support development.
Well, let's talk about some of those kind of cross-cutting issues then, working with the other banks, for example, because there are several multilateral development banks. Some have expertise in some areas that might be greater than the World Banks. Maybe the African Development Bank has greater expertise in infrastructure financing in Africa, for example. So how is the World Bank going to work, going to play nicely with the other kids on the block to make sure that outcomes are achieved for the world as opposed to for the individual organizations?
Let me first recognize that you have done a very good job in pushing us all to take that question very seriously. Of course, working on our own, each one of us, we contribute. But working together, we contribute much, much more. So what we have done in recent years is to take some of the really big challenges for development, like infrastructure finance, and say, can we, rather than competing with each other, look at what needs to be done, and then we bring our resources in a more coordinated manner. During the spring meetings this year, there would be a meeting of the Global Infrastructure Forum, and this is what it has done, pushed organizations to look at the huge challenge in front of us and then define how our contributions can be better coordinated and more effective. Does that mean that we are everywhere equally coherent? Of course not, because it takes time to get from the top leadership and the bottom presence in the countries to get full alignment. But I can say proudly that the development banks have been, in recent years, more aware that the whole has to be bigger than the sum of individual parts. Why are we more aware? Very simple. The exponential growth of needs is pressing us to recognize our own individual limitations. And the whole questioning of multilateralism that has come with people anxious because of this very fast-moving world of ours, it has made us realize that we should not take our mission and mandate for given.
So that exponential growth in needs or in problems. Let's think about climate change as the kind of the biggest development issue out there. How is the bank equipped to address a transnational problem like development, like climate change, with this new thinking, but also with the old structures like lending to sovereign nations, for example? How is the bank equipped to deal with those new challenges?
Well, this is an area where I'm very proud of the World Bank, because the World Bank was way ahead on the issue of climate change. Already in the 90s, I was director for environment in the late 90s, early 2000, and it was in my office here at the World Bank where a very smart colleague invented carbon trade. The very first one was done by the so-called prototype carbon fund. So we recognize that climate change is a huge threat to development, huge threat to efforts to reduce poverty, and that cannot possibly be dealt with by any nation on its own,
Or by lending to nations.
or by
sovereign
lending,
nations.
or by lending to individual nations in individual projects. So what we have done is to bring our analytical capacity to understand the nature of the problem and what are the no-regret policies that countries should embrace. And then, secondly, to mobilize concessional financing so we can help countries to get on a low-carbon path and also to deal with adaptation. Just one example. Through the Global Environment Facility, we at the bank work with China on a small project, $14 million project. It was to set up the framework for solar production. Now we have an $80 billion industry in China in solar because we have put the foundation of that industry right.
Is that $80 billion industry directly as a result of that $14 million project?
It has grown out of the appropriate regulatory environment. Yes, I mean, obviously we also invest a little bit in solar, but in relative terms it is primarily private sector. But it has grown because the foundation, the regulatory regime, the institutional foundation was right.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what, I talked about Vietnam. This is why countries are interested in the World Bank. What is the framework that we can put in place to deliver the results we want to see? And that on climate, for our portfolio, we have set up a fairly ambitious target, 28% to be for climate action. Everything we fund, 28% to be for that. And actually, when we look at that target, it is ambitious enough to force us to look for new ways to deliver on it.
Right, yeah. We don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to just get you to think about one other cross-cutting issue, which you have direct experience from at your time at the EU, and that's refugees, the humanitarian crisis in the world. Some 65 million people displaced. This is a real problem, a thorny, almost an existential problem for Europe. How could the bank help address that?
Well, the bank is doing three things. One is the economics of refugees and migration, forced displacement, understanding it. Because what we need to differentiate is the countries where displaced people come from, what is happening there. Usually it is war or natural disaster or both. The economics of the countries that are first stop for the refugees, the Jordans and the Lebanons of this world, and then the transition to potentially going to Europe or other developed parts of the world, and then see what can be done to reduce the flares of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, disaster risk reduction, so there are fewer people that are forced to flee.
But if the World Bank is becoming a catalyzer of private investment financing, how is that going to address the problem of humanitarian crisis?
This is, let me give you a very concrete example. Take Jordan. Jordan, Lebanon, they're hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees. What we do is to raise concessional finance so investments can be made at concessional terms for these refugees to be integrated in the economy without competing for jobs with the local people or for schools with the kids, the Jordanian kids. So we do that as institution. We brought about $1 billion. So when Jordan is to borrow, we bring down the cost of these loans because it is for this purpose.
Okay.
But let me give you a very important example of what we do.
I just have to ask you to be very brief as we are running out of time.
I'll be very brief. Right now, 20 million people are at risk of losing their lives because of famine or very severe drought. From South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, the northern part of Nigeria. We are not a humanitarian organization, but we built a bridge with the humanitarian community so we can inject our longer-term sustainability, development thinking in actions that are being taken. We committed $1.6 billion to tackle this risk of famine, and we are bringing the UN agencies and the rest of the development world together so we prevent a catastrophe from happening.
Okay. Kristalina Georgieva, it's been fascinating to talk with you. Sorry to cut you off there, but we are out of time. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
You can see this again. It'll be archived on the Bank's Open Learning Centre website. You can also see some of this and hear some of it as a podcast on the CGD website, cgdev.org, as well as everything that the Centre for Global Development is working on. I'm Rajesh Merchandani. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation as part of the Financing for Development MOOC, and thank you very much for watching. Thank you.
Thank you.